Well, hello and welcome to this webinar. If we are all ready and willing, we will gradually make a start. I know that a number of people will join as we get going, so I'm not going to rush it off. But our team from the Strategic Concept for the Removal of Arms and Proliferation, Scrap Weapons, is delighted to once again join with the International Peace Bureau's Global Days of Action Against Military Spending. And if ever they were needed, one would say it's now, as we see military spending topping $2 trillion. We're waiting for the latest numbers from CIPRI, I think. My name is Dan Plesh, and I lead the Scrap Weapons Project at SOAS University of London. And I'm delighted to be joined by the other members of our team. Eloisa Romani will focus on our work on a draft treaty text on general and complete disarmament, long an objective of the Global South, the international community, since at least the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom of 1915, and arguably, and in present circumstances, slightly ironically, the objective of the Tsar of Russia in calling the Hague Conferences on Peace around 1900. And Eloisa will be talking about our effort to help the international community reactivate or activate the UN's 4th special session of the General Assembly on disarmament, which has been there latently as a decision for rather too long. And we hope everybody involved in this webinar will join us for a warm-up session on that topic in September, and perhaps involve their own constituencies in helping join and develop these ideas. Eloisa will be followed by Henrietta Wilson, one of our advisory committee members and consultant, who leads our work on open source research and what we call a nascent global weapons tracking system. And to that end, she'll be followed by Zara Capesi, who will take us through our weapons tracking website, which is a portal of bookmarks of work on global weapons tracking that we hope people in this webinar and your friends and colleagues will be able to make use of as we go about looking to develop confidence and security building measures based upon transparency. But for my part, I want to start with the context for scrap weapons as we experience the fires of war in Ukraine, of course, but also Ethiopia, Yemen, and Congo come to mind, to name but 3 others. All the nations of the world, for spiritual, excuse me, I can move my text along here, multiple screening, excuse the slight hiatus. So, all the nations of the world, for realistic as well as spiritual reasons, must come to the abandonment of the use of force, and likewise aid and encouragement for all other practical measures which will lighten for peace-loving peoples the crushing burden of armaments needs to be a priority. Not my words, but the words of the first founding official text of NATO on its website, issued by the British Prime Minister and the US President as the Atlantic Charter long, long ago in 1941, and incorporated into the UN Charter and as the foundation of NATO. If ever there was one document which is the foundation of the rules-based international order that we are oftentimes asked to support, then that charter and these words are that founding document. Now, when these words were first issued as a war aim in the Second World War against the actual, original, classic Nazis, rather than the effort nowadays, everyone seems to be desperately seeking Hitler everywhere one looks. But when the Nazis were winning the war and slaughtering entire populations as they went along, tragically across some of the same bloodlands assaulted by Putin. So today, faced with a far lesser crisis, there is no excuse for redoubling our efforts to implement this part of grand strategy that also echoed the aspirations of Wilf and of the IPB. Because if, to be frank, the American president and the British Prime Minister and their allies could think in the arguably the darkest days of civilization, when the Nazis are expected to win the war, that disarmament, relief from the crushing burden of armaments, need to be, for realistic as well as spiritual reasons, a key wartime objective. Who are we to aim for any less? Now, in Ukraine, we have discovered that deterrence, which we're oftentimes asked to rely upon, boils down to a little more than a prayer for the sanity of Mr. Putin, and that we continue to enjoy the luck to ride out accidents that Professor Pelopidas reminds us of. We always had to wonder, how do you deter a madman? How do you deter an accident? These issues are all too real today, but we do know that the classic deterrence formula, assuming of a rational world and tit-for-tat actions, is belied by the actions and developments of the war in Ukraine that we see. Nuclear saber rattling, or in Helen Caldicott's phrase, missile envy around Ukraine, has reminded a wider public that when self-destruction looms, then cooperation is essential to prevent self-destruction. The commentators pause and go, well, we may be realists, but we don't want to go this far. And this, I think, provides the fundamental dynamic that drives the need to control and lessen weapons in general and military spending in particular. Although it doesn't get much attention, we are actually quite fortunate that arms control and disarmament have limited Russia's missiles raining down on Ukraine as we speak. The now recently defunct Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, although violated by Russia and arguably by the US, verifiably scrapped a vast accumulation of dual-capable missiles, which in their conventional form would be falling on Kiev and other Ukrainian cities as we speak, absent such an agreement. And indeed, the shorter range missiles being used by Russia today would all also have been scrapped had NATO acceded to Mr. Gorbachev's proposals for their destruction back in the late 1980s. Building on that kind of vision, we should be bold again and propose to eliminate not just nuclear weapons, but all of these missile delivery systems beyond the very shortest range defensive systems. Now, the horrors being inflicted by Russia make it hard to take stock and take this kind of overview. But note that some analysts, for example, Newsweek's Bill Arkin and former US official John Wolfstyle, have already questioned whether Western military spending is justified in light of the poor performance of Russia's army and navy. As another commentator, Trent Telenko, put it, Western intelligence has for 70 years failed to notice that Russia never introduced modern logistics systems into its army. We're just relying on the huge numbers of conscripts to carry out functions which in the Western militaries have long ago been automated. And these failings are becoming all too clear in the confrontation and fighting across Ukraine today. Beyond the technical drawbacks, Western intelligence also failed to notice the widespread corruption that has turned the Russian orc's cudgel rotten from within. In short, we should look for allies more broadly in our societies who can join with us to take a more realistic view of the threats that we are presented to us and which for so long have justified very large military spending. After all, the Russian army, we were broadly expected to believe, was capable of fighting the whole of NATO. And we have discovered that in a few short weeks, the Russian army has in large part been disaggregated by the ill-equipped but extremely determined resistance of the Ukrainian army and people. That is a country of 40 million people, in many respects outgunned by the Russians. And without going into too much detail in the time, we know that some 70 to 80% of the entire Russian army responsible for Russian security from the Baltic to Vladivostok has been committed into Ukraine and has suffered already some 25% casualties, a huge attrition rate of that vaunted military machine. But we shouldn't simply make our reassessment of needs dependent upon Russian failure. It was almost 40 years ago that Mary Kaldor wrote about the Baroque arsenal, that is, the tendency to produce over-complex weapon systems that had outlived their usefulness. And people in the West who sought to make that argument about the obsolescence of over-sophisticated large-scale weapon systems have been ignored over the years. But within a few short weeks, we see in Europe, as has happened in other parts of the world earlier, that the vaunted tank costing millions is subjected to defeat by the modern day bazooka costing a few thousand. That the Russian battleship cruiser, Moskva, with hundreds of conscripts presumed dead, costing tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, was destroyed, it would appear, by a couple of missiles worth and costing perhaps a few tens of thousands. And this disparity of technology, which in previous eras we've seen when, in English mythology, when the English longbowmen slew French knights in armor, when the machine gun dealt with cavalry, this turn of the technology favoring lighter weight, cheaper systems against highly expensive large systems is one that I think we can use to find common cause with organizations as varied as taxpayers' alliances and treasury departments in not allowing the corporate military lobby to continue to bamboozle us with exaggerated threats and outmoded and overpriced systems. And I think that there is a new set of alliances that we can make to help carry forward these strategies and to reduce spending, perhaps for taxation relief, or to support other priorities in health and zero carbon strategies. But there is, of course, also a need, in the old Reagan-Gorbachev phrase, to trust and verify, that one needs to ensure compliance, that we need to not merely look to ourselves, but we need to look at a global system of common and collective security. And as part of that, we need to think about how we upgrade trust and verify for the mid-21st century. And we hope that some of our contributions, and what we think of as two powerful precision tools that we look to put into the hands of movements and treasury departments and taxpayers alike, can help move this forward. And so first of all, we will hear from Eloisa and then from Henrietta and Zara. So thank you very much for joining us again today, and over now to Eloisa.
Thank you very much, Dan. Good afternoon, everyone. So first, I would like to start by pointing out that in the current international scenario, reducing military spending is often seen as unrealistic or not desirable. However, for those engaged in peace-building efforts, it is important to stress and to reiterate that increasing military spending and investing in the so-called military-industrial complex not only produces more weapons that make the breakout of conflict more likely, but also creates militarized economies that are then difficult to reconvert into different profitable economic structures. So this predicament then produces a vested interest in continuing to invest in highly remunerative technological means of warfare. And this goes hand in hand with maintaining a strategic culture of international securitization, which uses the logic of deterrence as a rationale. And over time, this ignites a vicious cycle of increasingly militarized economies whose operation is justified by the discourse of global anarchy and the need to bring order and stability through nuclear deterrence. However, the approach of nuclear deterrence is not going to fade away with changing geopolitical scenarios, as its resilience beyond the end of the Cold War has shown us. Instead, it has been now replaced by the more complex discourse of integrated deterrence, introduced just recently in January by the Biden administration. In particular, Colin Calden, their Secretary of Defense for Policy, introduced the concept of integrated deterrence during the Defense One Outlook 2022 summit, and explained that integrated deterrence means integrating different domains of warfare, namely conventional, nuclear, cyber, space, and informational, and specified that the concept will inform almost every foreign policy decision. So our argument here is that this new strategic culture of more sophisticated deterrence only contributes to further destabilize international relations. And to revert the trends, it is important to introduce a new virtuous cycle of confidence building mechanisms to implement the so-called preventive diplomacy. And we believe that this can be done by governments by way of implementing transparency measures in the form of reporting military spending. And an important milestone to this regard has been the establishment in 1980 by the UN of a reporting mechanism on military spending through the Resolution 35/142. This instrument requests that each member state declares the full amount of its military budget and military assets. Then in 1991, the UN established the United Nations Register of Conventional Arms, ROCA, an annual reporting mechanism through which governments can share information on weapons they transferred the previous year. More recently, in December 2019, the General Assembly adopted Resolution 7453 called Transparency in Armaments, calling upon member states to provide the UN Secretary General by the 31st of May annually with the requested data for the register, including need reports if appropriate. And at the same time, Resolution 7424 called Objective Information on Military Matters, including transparency of military expenditures, invites voluntary reporting of standardized data on military expenditure through online reporting forms with a detailed reporting matrix and instruction. And this procedure is called MILEX. However, the problem so far has been that the number of countries participating in the reporting mechanism has often been relatively low, and data shared from the Interparliamentary Union shows that as reporting is voluntary, only 30 to 40 out of 193 member states normally submit a report to the United Nations register each year, and that the information being provided may not always be complete and accurate. However, the latest data on the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs website shows that up to this moment, the UN Register of Conventional Arms has received reports from more than 170 states, and that the vast majority of official arms transfers are capture rate. So this may hint to the success of the latest UN resolution establishing the MILEX mechanism. And to continue the positive trend, Parliament should emphasize the request to governments to submit accurate reports for the sake of transparency, military spending, and parliaments can, they play an important role in reviewing national reports before they're submitted to the register. However, a more fundamental role that they can play is to promote discussions about redirecting funds from the military sector towards providing welfare services to meet the primary needs of citizens, including public health and education. A crucial factor that needs to be tackled here is that the solution to reducing the incentive to military spending could be the conversion of militarized economies to a different type of advanced industrial economy. And in this sense, the UN may help broker an agreement receiving inputs from parliaments and civil society that consider alternative solution. An example is the recommendation highlighted in the UNODA occasional paper number 35 issued in 2020 for governments to develop programs that can help the defense sector to adapt to civilian production. In particular, governments could offer retraining, marketing, financial and technical assistance to defense contractors, and the conversion of economies that are partly militarized. We believe it's a viable solution to break the self-reinforcing cycle that connects the arms industry with the production of conflict. So a concerted effort towards comprehensive disarmament is the responsibility of actors at all levels of decision-making. We believe that parliaments can welcome the contribution of civil society actors who are able to provide technical expertise in terms of keeping the defense industry accountable through open source transparency and verification mechanism. To this end, Scrap Weapons sets out to provide two strategic tools to governments to implement global disarmament goals as set out in the Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The first instrument is the Scrap Treaty, that is a model framework for a legally binding international agreement based on the provisions of other existing international agreements. This results is the adoption of the General and Complete Disarmament Agenda. It is important to note that the Scrap Treaty sits in a different niche than that of the nuclear disarmament embraced by the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, although Scrap managed to include a mention to general and complete disarmament in the preamble of the TPNW. Scrap Weapons maintain that an agenda for general and complete disarmament is especially necessary to account for the predicament of states not situated in the global north, whose society suffer the consequences of trafficking of conventional arms, including small arms and light weapons. So at the heart of global of general complete disarmament is actually the link between development and disarmament. Progress on this relationship between development and disarmament has recently been made at the UN with Resolution 7637 adopted in December 2021, whereby the General Assembly showcased the linkage between disarmament and development supported in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So that's a progress on the part of the UN in advancing the General Complete Disarmament Agenda. The second instrument proposed by Scrap Weapons is the Global Weapons Tracking Service, which will be presented later by my colleague. I will just mention that it's a portal to providers of services that use open source satellite technologies for tracking weapons traffic. And I'd like to emphasize that identifying corruptions in arms trafficking is important to limit the proliferation and the availability of arms worldwide, especially because there is a thin line between legal and illicit trade of weapons. Weapons always have a role in creating conflict, and many societies, mostly in the global south, still experience political and social instability as a result of the armament of state and non-state actors and groups by both licit and illicit arms trade. It is crucial to reduce spending in the production, procurement, and trade of arms. This is particularly important from a gender humanitarian perspective because women, girls, and non-binary people are the most vulnerable victims of the use of force that is directly related to the availability of weapons. So Scrap Weapons is further developing the global weapons tracking portal in a view to make it available to different public users, including national parliaments all over the world. And this is an online portal to organizations working on open source information that parliamentarians may easily use to research the arms trade and emerging crises and to sensitize government to divert military spending and use public resources to meet more urgent societal needs. And I will also like to mention that one of the projects of Scrap is that we are working on the organization of a conference at SOAS University of London on the 6th of September 2022. It will be held in hybrid mode, and it's called Activating a Fourth Special Session of the United Nations General Assembly devoted to disarmament. It's very important because the threat of global war looms, but there is no practical strategy for weapons control. And the UN had agreed to hold the fourth special session of the General Assembly devoted to disarmament, but still this has not transpired. And we have therefore created a call for action for governments and organizations to sign with the objective to gather consensus in view of the drafting of a comprehensive statement that may be presented to the UN General Assembly with a formal request to activate the special session on disarmament. And I will now like to hand over the floor to our colleague Henrietta Wilson, who will introduce the function of the Global Weapons Tracking Portal as a transparency tool.
Thank you very much, Eloisa, and thank you, Dan, for your comments as well. You've both given really fascinating insights into the context of our work and the context of the International Peace Bureau's Global Days of Action Against Military Spending. Thank you too to everybody who's joined us. It's great to see so many people here, and it's exciting to be part of this conversation. So Eloisa and Dan have mapped out some of the purposes for disarmament, you know, the crying need for disarmament now, and some transparency tools that are out there already. What I'm going to now do is kind of take a step back and give us some very broad brushstroke comments about the role of transparency in creating disarmament treaties. And after that, as mentioned, I'll be handing over to Zara, who's going to give a detailed insight into our work at SCRAP. So most of the world's disarmament we imagine to be done through global treaties, international treaties, in which different states join and mutually reduce their armaments in a way that seem to be secure, irreversible and robust and doesn't undermine anybody's security. If everybody reduces at a similar rate, it's thought that everybody will increase their security. The history of weapons treaties really shows that transparency matters to them. And we can see this, there's evidence for this in the fact that increasingly treaties have incorporated more intrusive verification measures. So, for example, the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention has very few verification measures, whereas the 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention has really detailed systems for how states verify each other's compliance with the convention. And they do this through making annual declarations that are absolutely mandatory part of joining the treaty. They have to declare what's going on in their industry, in academia, in all sorts of areas related to the convention, and also they agree to being routinely expected in those according to those declarations. So much more intrusive than the Biological Weapons Convention, indicating that states increasingly accepted that intrusive verification was helpful in disarmament. I should note on that measure that in terms of treaty verification, that it's not seen as limitless transparency. In fact, in negotiating a treaty, states are very careful to include a delicate balance between things that they are allowing to be visible and things that they want to keep secret. So they allow sensitive military or commercial secrets to be kept secret. So there's some evidence that transparency matters to disarmament, and there's also evidence that it matters in and of itself in the military sphere. So a number of treaties from the end of the 1980s, early 1990s through to 2000s were explicitly aimed just at transparency. I can put to you the 1986 Helsinki Accords, which developed confidence and security building measures where people exchanged information. And then later that we had the 1990 Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, and in 2001 we had the Open Skies Treaty. All of these treaties were ways that states said, okay, we'll let you see what's going on in our military spheres, you let us see what's going on in your military spheres, and generally that was thought to build stability and security for everyone. So transparency is deeply connected with disarmament, as seen as very important to achieving robust disarmament. Until now, the people doing the transparency have been states or international organisations set up specifically to manage treaty verification. And that's really because states and international organisations were the only people with the capacity to do the sorts of activities that were needed. This has changed now. nowadays non-state organisations or individuals can see a whole lot of stuff that's going on around the world. And they do this through open source research, sometimes called open source intelligence or OSINT or open source investigations. All of these things mean the same sort of set of activities, which is watching the world through publicly available tools and information. There's always been an aspect of open source research. Anybody that's done research that's used newspapers or scientific journals or listening into radio broadcasts, that's all open source research because it's publicly available information. But now the scope and the reach of open source research has been absolutely transformed by the internet, which means that many more people can access many more traditional media than has ever been possible before. For the people here today, I'm sure we can click through Google and get international news in different languages from different regions much more easily than we could do before the internet. But on top of that, there's completely new sources of information that we couldn't access before as non-state individuals. And Eloise has already mentioned satellite imagery is one of them. There's lots of expensive satellite imagery that's really high resolution, but we can also access entirely free satellite imagery, completely open for many people in the world. And also we have access to social media, which people scrutinize for evidence of all sorts of things, and is a mechanism through which witnesses can publicize things that are going on in their neighborhood. And so we can see people posting about what's happening in some of the places that Dan mentioned, you know, Ukraine, Ethiopia. If you have a mobile phone these days, you can get information about war zones to be broadcast around the world. So there's a question for us at Scrap. What difference does non-governmental open source research transparency make to disarmament? And it seems that there's a really clear connection. Open source research can provide transparency. Weapons treaties, disarmament treaties need transparency, and it feels like that should be an automatic win for both sides. But it's of course more complicated than that. And one of the complications is it's not entirely clear how treaties can use non-governmental open source research. There's conversations happening around that in relevant treaty organisations. Apart from that, it's also not quite clear that the field of open source research is particularly well understood by decision makers or the public or officials or international organisations. So by that I mean, I think we're all surrounded by open source research. When we open newspapers, we see the satellite imagery of the tanks in Ukraine or the horrific imagery about mass graves. So we see it, but we don't necessarily ask the right questions of the open source research that's increasingly dominating what we know about the world. So we at Scrap are trying to address this need, this kind of understanding of open source research. And we're doing this in several ways. We've published some short articles about it, and we're working on editing a book featuring open source research practitioners in different sectors and their work strengthening human security. And also, we are working with Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts in the United States to build a website, a kind of example website of what could be done that's acting as a portal to open source research that relates to weapons uses or the existence of weapons. So that's one of the things that we call the Global Weapons Tracking Service, excuse me, and I will now hand over to Zara to give us an in-depth view of that website. Thank you very much, Zara.
Thank you, Henrietta. So Scrap Weapons, as Eloisa explained, offers two precision tools for global weapons control. The first is a framework for a treaty on general and complete disarmament, which is, as Eloisa explained, a model international agreement based on proven best practice. And the second is the Global Weapons Tracking website, which you can see here and which I will be introducing today. So the Global Weapons Tracking website is a new tool which aims to help build transparency on the use and movement of weapons around the world. The website, as Henrietta explained, was built by 2 successive teams of undergraduate students from Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts, and we are currently in the process of welcoming our 3rd team to further develop the website. So the website itself is designed to act as a portal to organisations who provide open source research tools and information which are publicly available and which aid in creating some transparency around weapons. So on the website, you will find open source research, which looks at weapons holdings, exports, illicit proliferation and use. So as you can see here, the organizations which provide services and information are divided into 4 categories. If you hover over a category, it shows you a short description about what the page will include. And if you click on one, so let's click on tracking weapons here, it opens up to a page showing all the organizations which are monitoring the possession and movement of weapons. So on this page, you will find organizations which provide information across the world. So for example, CIPRI documents weapons and proliferation and trade across the world, or even Corruption Tracker. And then you'll also find organizations which are focused on a specific country. So for example, we have Project Sandstone here, which focuses on North Korea, and CADS here, which focuses on South Sudan. And even the EU Arms Project, again, focusing on the EU. As you can see, again here, if you hover over a name, it shows you a short description of what the organization is, which makes it easier to find what you're looking for. And if you click on a name, so let's click on CIPRI here, it opens up to a page with a longer description about the organization, as well as a link to their website or the tool that they offer. There is also a wheel as such here, which makes it easier to move between the different pages. But I'm going to take you back to the home page now, and I just want to talk about the different categories. So as mentioned, the organizations are divided into 4 categories, and we have our tracking weapons, as you would expect, and we also have tracking tools, which looks at, so we have flight radar here, which tracks planes, we have a satellite tracker and a ship tracker. But I also want to mention this page here, which is the weapons and human rights violations. So although these organizations here don't exactly track weapons, they do look at crisis investigation, and they have conflict records too. So in this way, it can be used to monitor the use of weapons in these situations and how they have led to violations committed. So although it's not exactly a direct weapons tracking tool in this sense, by tracking human rights abuses and conflict, you can, through that, monitor weapon use. And a final category that I do want to also point out is this page here, which is think tanks, training and services. I think this is particularly important because by providing a page with services, training, courses for people to train in open source research, it creates a sense of accessibility to open source research by opening it up to non-governmental organizations and even journalists. Open source research isn't always the most easiest to understand or use if you do not have any training or a background in it. This does create an element of, although you do have to work a bit for it, it does create an element of accessibility, which I believe is quite important in this road to transparency. Going back to the home page, at the bottom here, we have some maps. So these maps were, at the bottom of the page, are a result of the tremendous effort. Sorry, I'll just refresh my page. So the maps here are a result of the tremendous effort by the last WPI team, who created them by processing data provided by the Stockholm Institute Peace Research Institute. CIPRI, and UN ROCA. So there are 4 interactive maps, and they show the global imports, exports, and stockpiles of large weapons, in addition to transparency indicators for voluntary reporting of countries over time, which you can see by moving this slider at the bottom. As you can see, the colors change as the numbers change as time goes on. And you can zoom in and zoom out using these controls here. But if you also hover over a country, it provides you with a breakdown of the data that the map is showing for a specific country. So you can see numbers for the number of aircrafts, engines, missiles, naval weapons, satellites that country holds in that year. So you can see everything that they owned or currently own at this time. So that is our global weapons tracking website. And so overall, as mentioned, this website is a portal. So it's almost like a yellow pages, as I like to call it, for open source research available around the world, which can be used to track global weapons. And so Scrap Weapons hopes a portal like this can assist in furthering the call for general and complete disarmament by showing that there are tools out there to create accountability through transparency. I believe we will now be opening up the floor to any comments and questions. So if you do have anything you'd like to add or any questions you'd like to ask, please do put them in the chat box. Sorry, Dan, I think you're muted.
You're muted, Dan.
Yes.
And one more time. Thank you very much, Zara, Henrietta, and Eloisa. So we've got a few minutes for questions and discussion, and we'll be able to make this recording available to people who couldn't be with us this afternoon. Good to see some new friends and old friends amongst the attendees.
So in the absence of anybody else having a question, I have a question for our team. I'd like to know more about the preparations for the September conference that Eloisa mentioned. I don't know if you could say any more about that, please.
Yeah, sure. So at the moment, we are looking to build a global constituency of stakeholders coming from civil society organization, groups engaged in disarmament, as well as government representatives. And also we are looking to build, like during the conference, a session that is looking into the importance of peace building efforts made by representatives of different religions worldwide, and that will be continuing the legacy of the collaboration we have been having with the Holy See, the Vatican, in the last year. And so we are actually in contact with several religious representatives, and we are building collaborations in addition to IPB, also with IPU, and the Secretary General of IPU in particular has also recommended the Global Weapon Tracking Service to different parliaments worldwide. So that's an interesting beginning to actually possibility for stakeholders to use the Global Weapons Tracking Service. And now we are in the process of defining the program of the conference. And in particular, we are requesting governments and organizations to sign our call for a special session on disarmament at the UN General Assembly. And I'm going to share the call here in the chat, and it's actually available also on our website, which is scrapweapons.com, and the call can be found in the relevant section of convening and for a special session on disarmament under projects. And so that's a way for us to actually build global consensus towards this important goal, because three special sessions on disarmament were actually held at the UN General Assembly. As I said before, the four never transpired. However, in 2017, a working group has actually defined agenda objectives, and there's been they've also been welcomed by Izumi Nakamitsu, who is the representative for disarmament affairs, and so we really hope that we can help in building this momentum for the agenda of disarmament to proceed at the UN, and in particular, as I mentioned, we are particularly looking into advancing the agenda of general and complete disarmament, which believe it's actually more comprehensive than just focusing on nuclear disarmament, because it incorporates different consequences of conflicts deriving from the use of conventional weapons, which is affecting several groups like women, girls, non-binary people in particular. And it's something that is often neglected by the discourse on nuclear disarmament, which is there is a feeling which is something more considered in the global north, but the problem for people in the global south are actually tangible and derived from the use of conventional weapons like small arms and light weapons. So that is why for scrap weapons it's important to advance the agenda for general and complete disarmament. So I hope that somehow answered the question.
Great. Do you have a question from Jack? Yeah, I'm just looking.
Yeah, so Jack is asking, how effective has open source research been in the Russian invasion of Ukraine so far? The mainstream media sources have been very confusing on the subject so far. So
I think there's a lot of
so that's the question from Jack.
yes, there's a lot of disinformation out there, Jack, I think. And it's hard, I think, for people to sort out what's reliable and what isn't. I mean, I think I look to, some people such as Hans Christensen from the Federation of American Scientists, and looking at the Twitter feeds that one can draw on, and who is saying what and who is validating and making an assessment of those. So personally, I find Ukraine Weapons Tracker and a somewhat bizarrely named Oryx Spion Kop, which is, although it is Dutch, it's a South African reference point, which I won't go into. And the latter taking upon himself to compile all the photographic video evidence of every piece of military kit that can be seen to have been destroyed. And this source has been used very widely, I think, and this is where quite a lot of the data comes from about the horrendous equipment losses that the Russians have, the unsustainable equipment losses that the Russians have found, and that he and others, I think, are extremely good at a level I could never aspire to, in terms of identifying particular weapon types and then origins. So, for example, picking up that a certain weapon is only used by the Russian Navy infantry based in Vladivostok, indicating that the Russians had to be fairly desperate to transfer a military unit across many, many time zones, for example. But more broadly, I think, while I think many of us, and I'm one included, thought the Russians wouldn't attack for precisely many of the reasons that have now unfolded, that it would be disaster, but nevertheless, Western intelligence and the satellite, some of the well-known satellite firms were providing transparency. Now, the transparency itself didn't stop anything from happening. Other countries could have made other decisions. They could have decided to attack the Russian forces as they crossed the border, if not inside Russia, rather than leaving the Ukrainians to get on with it. Other decisions could have been made about support for Ukraine. But what is clear is that the Russians were not able, and no one can look to mobilize their military without it being seen, unless you see a degradation of satellites in a very large scale. And this level of transparency, I think, is of a completely different order to anything that went on in the 20th century. And that, I think, is something that the Iraq inspectors that some years ago Henrietta and I interviewed with respect to, you know, lessons from the Iraq regime, and the bottom line was, well, actually, it's all so much simpler now because of the power of satellites.
Thank you, Dan. Can I just add a little bit to that? I think Jack's question is really important because I think, as Dan indicated, Ukraine, like Syria, is demonstrating some really worrying trends. We know it's horrific. In terms of the information usage, we're seeing an increasingly contested information landscape. So there is clear deliberate disinformation campaigns playing into things. It's hard to read the difference between different sources as members of the public, which is again one reason that we thought something like the website that Zara outlined would be useful, to kind of give a list of authoritative sources. It's not comprehensive yet, but we can see the need. That it's not enough just to have the information. It's important that the information is validated. And so the onus is kind of put on consumers of information, us, to check the legitimacy of sources at the moment, and that looks very similar to things that we're familiar with doing instinctively in different contexts. So checking the provenance, checking who's telling you what they're telling you, whether they're likely to be authoritative, checking if they can tell you how they arrived at their findings. That's very important. And the sources that Dan gave can do all of that. There's also, I think, quite an interesting trend with open source research that there are pressures, because of the technological capacity, there are pressures for people to arrive at findings quite quickly, to work out what's going on at speed, which doesn't necessarily lead to the best results. So again, the onus is on consumers and the research practitioners themselves to kind of be careful and interrogate results to check that they're likely to be accurate or not. Yeah, thank you.
I've been treating a little off and on over the course of the last 2 months, and increasingly I'll make an observation and attach a question mark or two to it, rather than simply saying this is so, or this is my opinion. You know, it's like, query, is this something to think about? And I think that's important because, you know, certainly compared to even when I was doing this stuff professionally with news media, there's a huge amount more people out there in the space, and people wanting to, just like me, or like all of us, wanting to pontificate. And I think it's, you know, it behooves us to be modest and raise questions. But as we said in the presentation, I think there are some of the major questions are to the whole Western strategic studies community who bought the Russian threat, you know, as they did during the Cold War, and that those of us who, you know, tried to question that were derided, frankly, for questioning this. And what we've seen is a corrupt and hollow, but still vicious military. There's one individual who, you know, don't agree with everything that the individual says, but a former American official called Trent Telenko, I think, has established himself as quite a figure in some of the American media, because he just started off analyzing pictures of broken down Russian trucks and starting to talk about how, you know, you have to put a huge amount of energy into maintaining your vehicle fleet just to keep it moving. And that as an example.
Thank you.
And these sorts of issues, I think, weren't properly absorbed by people who just count beans, as it were.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dan and Henrietta. I would like to address another question we have received from Matt. He's saying absolutely incredible work. How much engagement have you had with UK parliamentarians and diplomatic corps? It feels your rational approach is missing from conventional debate at present.
Well, I think it's a question of, I would just say it's a question of, we're a little string quartet here, and we could do with amplification. That's the problem, I think, is we don't have the amplification to get our message out, or the strength to do that, and any help we can get, I think we would welcome.
Yeah.
And I think, we work with parliamentarians.
So at the moment,
oh, sorry.
No, please.
I think we work with parliamentarians as and when we can in the UK and elsewhere, and we do that through meetings and public-facing events as well. So I'm going to ask Eloisa to speak a bit to the webinar we organised last March. It was a public-facing event, but parliamentarians came to that, and also to the Freeze campaign that featured parliamentarians as well, as examples of the sort of things that we've done that community.
Yeah, exactly. We were in touch with parliamentarians actually from several countries, in particular for the Freeze weapons campaigns, which scrap weapons introduced last year. And it was, we actually presented a moratorium asking MPs to introduce that in parliaments to freeze the production, trade and supply of weapons. And the campaign received quite an important amount of support from parliaments and different organizations. And so it also received support from the International Parliamentary Union. And we also received some important support from the Holy See. And so it's very much one of our objectives to carry on this trend and to continue sensitizing and engaging parliaments worldwide. And it's something we particularly look very much to do for the organization of the conference we are having in September about the first special session on disarmament, requesting the UN General Assembly to hold that in the near future. And so I hope that answered the question. And I think there are not other questions at the moment. But
well, thank you all for a great afternoon.
Yes. Just mentioning that we are having a feminist leadership in disarmament webinar series, and we invite everyone to join the series. And I would like to ask Zara to share the link to register in the, oh yes, thank you for sharing that in the chat. And we are very much looking into giving importance from voices of women activists from the global south into the importance of disarmament and about reframing the women peace and security agenda. And our last webinar will be next Tuesday, and everybody is welcome to join. And thank you very much for your participation and your attention. Thank you. Bye.
See you all next. See us all next.
See you.
Thanks a lot. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Very good weekend.